Welcome to the social-engineer.org podcast number 107.
107.
So many podcasts.
It's many, many podcasts. So I was recently informed that I do a pretty crappy job at introducing the panel properly.
Yeah, you're pretty horrible.
Yeah, I'm pretty horrible. So my favorite person's not here, Ping, so I'll introduce her.
Whoa. I thought I was your favorite person.
I'm literally never his favorite person. It's just like the most humbling experience day to day. I'm constantly reminded that I'm at least fifth on the list.
And then my next favorite person, Dave. Dave, nice to have you here at this time.
Dave's above me?
You actually said something nice about me. Chris. I'm so happy today. I'm glad I actually joined the podcast, and you didn't schedule it during lunch. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome for both.
Ouch.
And I guess that's it. That's all I have to introduce.
Thanks. I'm just going to go over here and drink my tea without you.
Really loudly.
Really loudly.
No, we're here with Kat Murdoch. Kat, say hi.
Hello. I'm his favorite. We all know it.
She is. She's my favorite. Well, of course, I pay you to be here, so.
I'd like to believe I would be here anyway.
Yes, I think actually with you, that is 100% the truth.
Oh, I'll take it.
100% the truth. But anyhow, 107, we're doing great. We got a busy month ahead of us. But one of the things that happened recently, which I haven't talked a lot about on the podcast, but I got invited to give a TED Talk.
Nice.
And yeah, thank you. And I went into New York City and I met a gentleman there, Paolo Gaudiano, and he gave a fascinating talk on research that he's done into biases and how biases have affected companies, whether it's bias based on gender or color or any kind of bias, and how it's affected the growth of a company over a period of years, even studying this for decades. So I was so riveted by the information that he presented. I asked him if he would come on the podcast and discuss some of his research. He did a really fascinating study in CUNY in the City College of New York entitled Under the Quantitative Studies of Diversity and Inclusion. I think I got that all.
Yeah, I think he was the founder of that department, actually.
Oh, you are right.
Yeah.
He was the founder of that. So him and Gilda Barabino, they both launched that initiative back in 2017. So we have Paolo coming on the podcast today to discuss these biases. I think it will be a really fascinating topic for us. So why don't we get him on the show now? We are back on the show with Paolo. Paolo, nice to have you on the show.
Nice to be on the show. Thank you.
So I was telling the group here before you came on that we met at that wonderful TEDx Fulton Street just about a month ago, and about your speech on biases there. But maybe before we get into that, you could just kind of tell us about who you are and what you do in your research and where you've done it to kind of set the stage.
Sure. And unfortunately, I do one of those kinds of jobs, if you want to call it that is not exactly something you can explain in 5 seconds. You know, I wish sometimes with like my aunts and uncles that I could just say, oh, I'm a teacher. But it's not quite that easy. But in a nutshell, I'm a former academic. I used to be a professor until about 20 years ago, and then decided that I wanted to be a full-time entrepreneur, but maintaining a tie to academia. And all of the work that I do looks at how we can use different kinds of analytics, technology, and other scientific ideas to solve complex problems in the real world. And in particular, for the last 3 years or so, I've been really fascinated with the idea of how we can use some of these solutions to help people understand the value of diversity and inclusion and what the impact might be of different kinds of biases and prejudices in the workplace that could potentially be improved. And the way that I'm approaching that is through a combination of academic work. I have a recently established, in collaboration with the Dean of the School of Engineering at City College of New York, which is part of CUNY, the Center for Quantitative Studies of Diversity and Inclusion. And that's really doing a lot of the academic research on this topic. And then I've also started a small software company called Alaria. And our goal there is to develop software solutions that help companies, again, quantify what is the actual business impact of being more inclusive, of removing biases, of being more diverse.
Just at that basis, let's just start at the very basics. What kind of biases are you studying?
We study biases really of many different kinds. And I think there's something a little bit unique about the way that we approach it, which is that most people, when they think about biases, they think about the biases that individual people suffer or have, or whatever term you want to use for that. So people talk about unconscious biases that have to do with anything from how you respond to people that are different from you, to how you tend to select information that is more relevant to you, how we tend to favor information that is more recent. And there are names for all of these biases. We came to the realization that while those biases are significant, what sometimes is even more significant is the existence of biases that I would define as either structural biases or procedural biases. And these are the ones that I think really create problems, especially in corporate America, because these are biases that we don't see. These are biases that are embedded in either in the structure of how something is organized or in the processes that they implement. So of late, we've been really talking about those different kinds of biases at all three levels, from the individual level through the procedural levels, all the way up to the more structural biases.
How have you found that those play together? Like, do the individual biases, are they drawn to each other and then that creates the structural and process bias, or are they not related?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. They are generally related, and they often come from individual biases, but sometimes in ways that we would not expect. But to give you a very practical example, we've been doing a project recently in which we study the way that venture capital firms influence the flow of resources to entrepreneurs. And as we started to ask ourselves, why is it, for example, that only 0.2% of African American women, or I should say that the 0.2% of the venture capital funding that goes to entrepreneurs goes to African American women, and only about 2% goes to women founders in general? And what we realized as we started to map out the process is that an example of a structural bias might be if a VC goes to events where typically it's a great opportunity for entrepreneurs to introduce themselves to the VCs. If the VCs only go to certain events that tend to be attended primarily by majority people, then that's a structural bias that prevents them from being able to ever come into contact with people from different backgrounds. Whereas an example of a procedural bias might be that they hire, let's say, an associate to review initial proposals for ideas, but that associate may come from a background that prevents him or her from recognizing the value of ideas that come from people in different segments. That would be more of a procedural bias. Whereas a personal bias or individual bias might be a VC that is in a meeting with a woman, and in the back of his head, he's thinking, well, she's a woman, she's going to go and have children, and therefore I should not be putting my money in that. Now, to go back to what you were saying, of course, if the VC decides, or if the VC firm decides to support only certain events, ultimately boils down to a form of bias at the individual level, where the people that created those, or that created those ideas to go to events in the first place did not think, hey, maybe we should go to events that are more diverse. And maybe when they created the procedures, they did not think to say, hey, maybe we should make sure that we hire associates from diverse backgrounds so that we don't introduce those procedural biases. So they are all tied together, but they manifest themselves in very, very different ways.
So in your introduction, you said something about sometimes how biases may even be positive. In that setting, all of them sound like they can kind of be limiting or even negative. What's an example of where one might be helpful or good to have a bias?
Well, it's not so much, I think, that biases are necessarily good in and of themselves. In a way, I've done a lot of studies in my early career about things like neuroscience and development and evolution. And biases are really an absolutely essential part of the way that we function. Because in a way, what they represent is the fact that our brain wants to cluster things together. We want to recognize that anything that has four legs, a flat surface, and a back is a chair. We don't want to have to remember every single kind of chair that we see and have to learn every time we see a different chair we've not seen before. So biases are really just a manifestation of the fact that we as human beings always do whatever we can, or our brains do whatever they can to cluster things together, to say, oh, this is one of those, and I'm going to put it in that category. So I would say the reason why biases are there is because of a fundamental aspect of what we need in order to be able to survive. But in the case of workplace biases, I don't know that I can think of any specific cases where they're particularly beneficial. It's just that, again, they help us to function. They help us to be able to go from one day to the next without becoming overwhelmed by information.
So a bias in the workplace is definitely a limiter.
In general, yes. I mean, at least I would say the biases that we care about, meaning what are the behaviors or actions or policies in the workplace that lead to different people having different experiences strictly as a function of their personal characteristics. To the extent that you're doing anything that gives two people who are otherwise identical different experiences, then you're doing yourself a disservice. And that's, I think, where the impact of the biases is most felt, is that all of a sudden you have a person that is different from the norm. And if you could see me, I would be doing air quotes here. The norm could be what the majority of the people in the company look like, or how they act, or what kind of education they have, or their socioeconomic status. Somebody who does not fit that pattern, if their experience in the workplace is somehow worse than it is for the rest of the people, then that's a problem, because you're effectively reducing the effectiveness of people on your teams, and therefore you're reducing the overall performance of your company. So from that perspective, I would argue that the biases that we care about, we always think of them as being things that impair the performance of a company or have a negative impact in some way.
So let me back up to when you and I met over in New York City and you were giving that speech. You were talking about biases based on gender and how they affected a company's growth. Can you give us a little explanation of what you were talking about there?
Yes, gender is one example. It's an easy one because it's so pervasive. And I think that of all of the forms of bias that exist out there, I would say that in the corporate world, gender bias is one of the ones that has been studied most widely. The way that it manifests itself can be anything from as simple as I'm going to give a slight advantage to men over women in the way that I assign jobs. Or it might be something about the way that I evaluate the performance of individuals. And sometimes, by the way, even with the best of intentions, there was a study recently that showed that form of bias typically damaging to women is when male managers are reluctant to give direct feedback, especially constructive feedback, because they're worried about making somebody feel bad. But in so doing, what ends up happening is that women in the workplace get substantially less constructive and useful feedback than men. And then when the time comes for promotions or raises, they wonder why they're not getting the promotions and the raises. Now, if you think about how an entire company works, one of the things that fascinates me, and really the angle that I took initially in approaching this problem, is about the complexity. Because you find that these little biases that manifest themselves at the individual level can actually have dramatic ripple effects throughout the organization. So imagine a situation where you have a board of directors or maybe an executive team that has no women. Well, what's going to happen is that even if the men are really wonderfully altruistic, unbiased individuals, there will be certain things that they will not be able to do that women may be able to do. They may not be able to recognize how to make the workplace more welcoming for women. They may inadvertently create biases of the type we talked about before, where they'll say things like, oh, let's make sure we have company-wide meetings at 8:00. Well, it's a known fact that having early morning meetings is particularly difficult for women who tend to do the majority of the caretaking in families. The other thing that may happen is that you go out to hire people and you say, oh, we understand the importance of diversity. Let's hire a bunch of women at the entry levels. Well, the problem is that if these women do not have role models at the executive level, not only may they be disadvantaged because of the way the company is structured, but they may feel discouraged and they may feel less of a sense of belonging because they don't see anybody at the top levels that looks like them. And the same argument could be applied to any kind of bias, but you can see how these complex interactions, and you can kind of go on and say, well, maybe if a manager on a team does not recognize that he's being biased by giving more difficult assignments only to men instead of to women, those things, again, if you had a woman manager, that would become better. But in order to have a woman manager, you may need to have more people at higher executive levels to attract those people into the intermediate management positions. So all of these pieces are connected together, and it's very difficult to just tease them out and say, oh, here's the problem, let's fix it.
I actually have a two-part question, because just from a personal level, that's fascinating, right? But from a social engineering level, so like what we do for a living, so companies hire us to actually come and break in their buildings, right? And we will oftentimes use the very biases that you just talked about against them, knowing that most companies don't have women executives, that they hire women in the lower levels. Then when we come on site and we have a team of, like, let's say Kat and I are a team going to break into a building, we will not put her in a pretext where her position is one of authority, because that would make the target think, and that would go against a normal trained bias.
Interesting.
Right. So where they normally would see women in, she would be my secretary instead of my boss. Now, it's not right. It's not politically correct. It's not great. But we play on that, knowing that that's the way most people think about it, the gender bias. So if we don't want people to start thinking about us as a weird, odd team, then I'll be the boss and she would be the assistant. So from one end of the question, I kind of want to know from a social engineering angle how we learn about those biases, because that definitely helps us in our job. From a business owner perspective, your discussion is fascinating to me, because something like, I didn't know that fact. I didn't know that there were studies done that early morning meetings are more difficult for women if they are the caretakers at home. Although we never have early morning meetings, because I'm not an early morning person. I could see how that could be something that I could have made a mistake on, and not because I'm biased against women, but just not realizing that would be a more difficult time for the women in our company.
Right.
I'm curious from both angles, like how we learn about those biases from a social engineering angle to use them, but then also how we learn about them as business owners, so we don't abuse or damage our people, our people in the wrong way.
I'm curious. Oh, I was gonna say, I'm curious. I'm definitely curious in Paolo's answer. I would say, from working at SECom, Chris, there is a difference in that if I was the primary caregiver of a child, I would 100% tell you, hey, I cannot make this meeting, or this meeting is very, very hard for me to make because I'm taking X child to school. When in past employers, especially when I worked in finance, if I had said that, I would never have said that, because you do get looked down upon, and now you're not focused on your career, focused on your kid. And that is mutually exclusive in some office environments. And so I just would never have said it. But like, if you started scheduling a meeting at a time I could not make, I'd be like, yo, this is not working.
I think that a couple of comments. I mean, one of them is that what Kat just pointed out is an example of this importance of having people with different viewpoints and different experience at different levels. And in fact, Chris, what you were saying as well, right? I mean, the fact that you are not a woman and you're not probably currently the primary caretaker of young kids, although you may have been at some point in your life, but it's not that you're being evil or you're, maliciously trying to exclude women. It's just that you don't think about it. And having a combination of people on your team that will be able to identify those blind spots or fill in the gaps. But also, as Kat pointed out, you need to have an environment where that kind of response is actually welcome. And there are certain companies where that's not the case. And in fact, there is a stigma still associated with things like, as Kat was pointing out, being able to have the ability to take care of your family. There is another very interesting example of something along those lines was another study that just came out in which they found that flex time is it's considered to be one of the best possible benefits that companies can offer their employees. But in some companies, the flex time is actually seen as a bit of a death sentence. So people don't do it because they worry that if they take advantage of flex time, they will be labeled as being kind of a separate mommy track, right? Which is a terrible thing to think about. And so again, you get these really complex interactions and that manifest themselves in many ways. It's a little bit different in the first example you started with, which is about social engineering. And you asked, how do we learn about these biases? I'm not really sure, but I think that there too, being aware of the fact that there may be some of those biases is going to be the most important thing. And once again, if you have people on your team that offer a diverse set of viewpoints, you're more likely to have somebody that will raise their hand and say, hey, have you realized that this particular client team is all male, and therefore they may find it very weird if Kat comes in and takes a leadership role? So having that kind of awareness, I think, is probably as significant as any specific mechanism for learning about these biases.
So I feel pretty good, because that's what we do now as a company. I guess from an SE angle, it's not something we're always allowed to ask. So we make assumptions based on what we see in society, which it's not very scientific, right? But we'll look at a company, let's say we're hired by company X, And, we're supposed to go and break in one of their facilities and to test their security. So we'll start looking at their employee base, and we'll start to see, like, where are the men and women in the company? Who holds the C-level positions? Who makes decisions for purchasing or other things in the company? And that will help us to see if we feel that we should play on a particular bias or not while doing this, or if having Kat play a certain role would damage our ability to be successful because they're not used to seeing a woman in that position or something to that effect. So we tend to make assumptions based on things that we observe. But I'm happy to hear, like, what your answer to how we fix it from an internal point is something that we already do, which is kind of cool. So your suggestion, just to reiterate for everyone listening, is just ask. Don't be afraid to ask. I think a lot of people are afraid to do that because of the, especially with all the focus, like with the Me Too movement and sexual harassment, it almost feels really hard to sometimes just ask, like, am I doing this right? You feel kind of stupid. Like, shouldn't I know this? Wasn't I raised to be somewhat of a decent human being? Shouldn't I know that I'm being a jerk? And you don't always know it.
No, absolutely not.
And I would posit that it might be a little bit more nuanced than just ask, because you have to create the environment where it's okay to answer truthfully, from my experience, because I've been in situations where they ask because they were told by HR they have to ask. And I'm not going, I wouldn't be honest in response. Maybe Paolo has an answer to this. I don't know how you create that culture of, it's okay. I feel very comfortable calling you out on something. I don't know how you did that as my boss. But I feel extremely comfortable being like, this is a problem for me. I don't use that often, but in past companies, absolutely. If somebody asks, like, can you do this? Like, and I would say, no, that's when Eloise has dance or whatever. I would not have answered honestly. In my head, I would start figuring out how I can do both things at once, because it's not the asking that's the problem. It's the how you answer.
My sense is that a lot of what happens in an organization and a lot of what people describe as the culture of an organization is really driven from the top. And ultimately, if the executive team of an organization makes it clear through their actions and not just their words that they're willing to get feedback and they want to invite, in fact, feedback from their employees at all levels, that tends to create the kind of environment that you were saying that would be most helpful in making you feel comfortable about asking things and about giving feedback. Whereas some companies, unfortunately, just don't do that, which I think is a shame, because I think that when you're doing that, you are potentially losing a tremendous amount of opportunities, not only negative, but positive. Because if you encourage people to ask questions, you're very likely to uncover new ideas, new products, positive suggestions, and not simply people complaining about the fact that, oh gosh, you should not have had the meeting at 8:00 in the morning because I had to take care of my kids.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because, man, we're focusing mainly on gender bias, which I know that there's so many more of them. But one of the things that you talked about also in your speech was how that affects the growth of the company over a period of time, even as something as long as like a decade or longer. Can you tell us about what you found in your research about how it affected growth?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of it is through these computer simulations that we build that effectively capture the behaviors of individuals using things like behavioral science and psychology, social sciences, and also how the individuals interact with one another and how they respond to their environment. And then the computer simulations help us to identify all of the, or I should say, replicate all of the interactions that may take place within a company on a day-to-day basis or week-by-week basis. And if you think about the way that your talent, your human capital impacts your ability to grow, one of the key elements of that is going to be your ability to attract talent and to retain talent. Now, what do you need to do in order to be able to attract talent? Imagine there's imagine kind of a big table that represents the universe of all of the people in this country or wherever the case might be that could potentially be your employees. And now suppose that because of something that your company does, whether it's because of its policies or because of its HR department, suppose that people from certain classes are either completely unaware that you exist or they feel like they would not be welcome in your organization. You're now taking the table and you're cutting it in half. And effectively what you're saying is that I'm only going to be tapping, half or a portion of the potential pool of candidates. And then you have bias processes in the way that you review your resumes, and that cuts it in half again. And then maybe you have people that are actually interviewing that are not using good interview practices, and you cut it in half again. So all of a sudden, out of this enormous pool of candidates, you're only tapping from a relatively small set. And ultimately, it's a supply and demand game. If you are tapping into a tighter supply, it's going to cost you more money. And we've literally done simulations where by making very reasonable assumptions about labor markets and rates and for hiring people, you can show that a company that is more diverse can reduce its hiring costs by 10, 15, 20%. And then there is the second part of it, which is the retention, which is that great. Now you've hired more people from a broader pool. But if you have internal biases that make it less likely for certain classes of people to succeed, and those people end up leaving your company in droves, then you are effectively shooting yourself in the foot, because now you're going to have to go out and rehire people, retrain people, which is going to cost you both time and money. And both of those factors together can have, if you imagine sort of growing them over time as the company is expanding, any kind of handicap that you give yourself in terms of your ability to attract talent or your ability to retain that talent will clearly have an impact on your growth.
And then you even brought up something like even if they try to make a change, that it was very difficult to change the direction of the ship mid-sail, right? Isn't that something you brought up during your speech?
Yes, I was also referring specifically to that notion of kind of these ripple effects and the importance of looking at the whole system. And one example that I always like to give is something that's actually, without naming any names, I think you could point to almost any Silicon Valley company in the last 3 to 4 years that have been talking about diversity and inclusion. What do? They go and they affiliate themselves with a historically Black college and university or with a minority serving institution to hire some underrepresented minorities at entry-level positions. And then what happens? So let's say these African-American engineers come into a large tech company. Day one, they realize that their managers does not know how to manage them. They don't see anybody in the leadership that looks like them. So they realize that they don't really have a way up in the corporation. And then maybe they will have microaggression issues, or they'll go to the cafeteria and people will get up and move away from them. The result of that is 3 months later, 6 months later, 9 months later, these people leave. And when they leave, you're suffering what I said before. You're now going to have to rehire and retrain people. But on top of that, you've generated a bad reputation for your company. And it will be even harder for you to recruit more people from those segments of the population. And you will potentially turn off large segments of your consumers who hear about these problems that you have. So again, all of these things are tied together, which means that if you're going to steer that ship, you need to think in a very concerted way about all of the pieces of the organization. So you may need to have unconscious bias training to make sure that the people in the cafeteria don't behave in a derogatory fashion toward the new employees. You may need to have multicultural training for your managers. You may need to have people on your leadership team and on your executive team and on your board that are actually from diverse backgrounds so that they can help you to identify these problems and correct them. And those that look for a silver bullet solution are bound to fail. And we've seen that over and over and over again. Companies that spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars trying to drive diversity, but because they focus on the wrong things and they don't think about it holistically, they end up with a mess on their hands.
Kat, let's take a quick break from the show to talk about what is going on in the world of SE.
Lots of exciting things coming down the pipe. It is a crazy season.
It is a crazy season. I mean, we just got done with a most ridiculous physical pen test ever in the history of my life.
It was amazing.
And your very first one.
Yes, objectively
And we did not get shot.
We did not.
And we did not die. So things are good.
Yes.
That's awesome. But now that we're back from that excitement, we have to discuss some things that are coming up. So first big one is DEF CON and Black Hat. So Black Hat comes first. It's right around the corner. The APSE course completely sold out. But our advanced OSINT for SE course, you have two options. One has plenty of space and one is almost full. So if you're interested in being with Ryan and Colin in that class, then you better sign up quick because I think they're closing the door soon.
You should definitely be interested. It will be awesome.
You should. But if you've signed up for APSE, you're going to get to spend the week with Kat and I, which is going to be really exciting. Yeah, Kat's going to be with me training that class, so get ready for hours of family fun.
I'm super excited. I know that selfishly, APSE was one of the most fun experiences I've had as an adult. It felt like mini college. Like I left with real friends. Hi, friends.
Notice the silence. No, just kidding. No,
they weren't invited to the podcast.
Yes, that is why. And right after Black Hat, when everyone gets done beating me up for being a jerk, we go to DEF CON. And SE Village is just slamming this year. So, first of all, DEF CON has given us a ton of space. Like, we are talking over 6,000 square feet for SE Village. So, we should be able to pack in a bunch more people than we could last year. But here's the most amazing part I want to say. Neil Fallon is coming out to DEF CON. If you have joined up to be on the SECTF, guess what? He's going to be one of our judges. So take that. He's also giving a speech, which if you haven't read the abstract for that, go to social-engineer.org, click on the events, click on DEF CON, and go read his abstract right now. I mean it, like right now. Go do it. It's amazing. And we have the SECTF for kids and the SECTF for teens, which both still have slots open in that, and we have some crazy things planned for that. So you definitely want to sign up for that right now. We are really excited about DEF CON and the village that's going on this year, and it would not be possible without some companies that have been supporting us, both physical support and financial support. So let me mention them right now. Hillbilly Hit Squad, Chris Roberts and his crew out there in Chester, those guys are just awesome, and they're just so supportive of everything we do. Not just financially, but you'll see Chris out there in his kilt, hanging around the room and just being a generally good guy. KnowBe4, those guys, they run a great tool and some great webinars and some good training, and they're supporting us in that too. And Pin Drop Security, which has been a sponsor of ours now for, I think, 5 years, going on 6, and they're back again sponsoring us this year. So we can't thank those companies enough for what they've done to help us. And moving right along, so I don't want to take too long, right after DEF CON is DerbyCon, and if you haven't heard, we just launched the DerbyCon SECTF. So if you're coming to Derby, go sign up for that pronto. We are on a tight timeline, so we are only going to have that open for a month. You got to have your video submitted, and then we're going to choose only 6 contestants, maybe 5. We're going to have to see what our time frame looks like. So 5 or 6 contestants, and it's going to be a tight draw this year. And we're going to have the SECTF there, Mission Impossible, Can You Fool the Polygraph, and a couple really special SE panels this year that we'll announce later on the site. Again, our village there would not be possible without a couple really special sponsors, which is KnowBe4, also sponsoring DerbyCon as well as DEF CON. So they're really, really behind us. And Thoughts for Security, which has been supporting us for the last couple of years in kids events. And this year they're out there at DerbyCon supporting us too. Check the website, social-engineer.org, for more details on that. Last thing I'll say, as I'm now auctioneer talking, is 2 big events happened this month. Nick Furno's book just came out on investigating cryptocurrency. And I know this is an SE podcast, but if you're into cryptocurrency at all, you have to read that book. I am not a crypto guy, but I read that book mainly because he's my friend, but I actually fell in love with it while reading it. Great sense of British humor. Of course, you have to deal with all the S's that they add everywhere and, take out the Z's or Z's as they call them. But it's just a phenomenal book. I learned a lot. And big news is my book is completely done, and it's coming out actually the month that this podcast is released, in July. So you should start seeing that on Amazon right away. Whew. What did I miss, Kat?
I think you got it covered. Do you have any air left?
I finally breathed out.
Well done.
So I think now that we covered all that and took quite a bit of time, we should get back to the show.
Yeah.
And I know this may be a hard line. I know science doesn't like to put causality to things many times, but I just see if I can throw this question out there. Is it enough from, let's say, a social engineering angle to look at a company? Like, let's use that example you just said. If we were to get a client and we were to start analyzing the C level, and we see there are no African Americans in the C level. So then we look at management and we see no African Americans in management, to say, wow, the only African Americans that are there are in the janitorial service. So it would be really bad for us to send one of our African American employees in as a pretext, because they would definitely not fit. Do you think that's a sound type of reasoning when looking? And I'm not asking, I know that kind of plays on the bias, which is the very thing you're trying to fix, but does that type of reasoning at least sound like it would be somewhat accurate in the way to assess that company situation?
I think underscoring the fact that we're really looking for that ease of entry and not causing people to think, because it's the lack of thinking that is needed to not be questioned.
I think that I get the sense that we're kind of mixing two different things here. One of them is, I don't want to call it the sale, right? But you need to get people in a particular frame of mind in order to be able to take advantage of the techniques that make you successful as social engineers. And that requires choices that probably go counter to what I might want to do in the objectives that I'm trying to achieve. So our brains, I think, as you probably know, they're exquisite change detectors. Our brains are very much, the kind of the flip side of putting everything into categories is that there are mechanisms in our brain that are exquisitely tuned to anything that is out of the ordinary. And that's been shown to engage higher levels of brain activity when you see something that you don't expect. So from the point of view of what you're trying to do, it's entirely reasonable. You're trying to kind of mollify these people into a sense of just normalcy that will not raise any suspicions, will not make them even slightly aware of the fact that something is out of the ordinary, so that you can tap into their traditional thought processes and take advantage of those. If, on the other hand, your goal was to do something different, then of course the answer would be otherwise. I guess one thing that I would wonder is whether the surprise of having someone from an untraditional background be present at one of these events that you organize or one of these sessions, is that something that would just be a transient effect, that maybe if you have like a 30-minute introduction and people get used to the fact that, oh, okay, there's this African-American woman, or there's a person with a disability, or somebody from the LGBTQ community who's talking to me, and maybe within a few minutes that effect would go away and you would be able to be just as successful. I don't know. Or maybe, it could even be that the distraction might actually help you to achieve some of the things that you want to achieve. So I would almost encourage you to experiment a little bit, because leaving aside the SC side of things, if you think about it in terms of perpetuating those kinds of biases, that's clearly not an ideal thing. I mean, I would certainly love to see more people that are working in social engineering from more backgrounds, and the same thing in whether you're talking about cybersecurity, whether you're talking about a lot of these fields that are very homogeneous. It would be nice if there were new faces and new attitudes and new mindsets and new experiences brought into play. I'm not necessarily advocating that you do that at the jeopardy or at the cost of jeopardizing your business, but I think it's something that you might try to experiment with to see if maybe you get some unexpected results.
Yeah, now that's an interesting point, because one of the things we do is we have one service is called Phishing, and that's phone-based attacks. And we'll do social engineering attacks over the phone using both genders. And then we'll tell our clients that, let's say we have an HR pretext and it seems to work better based on statistics when a woman is playing that role as opposed to a man. And we'll tell them that this is potentially, a bias on their part that could be used by attackers. For example, in the real attack world, there's a scam that goes around where you get a call from an Indian woman saying that she's from Microsoft and notices some bad traffic on your IP address. They need to log into your computer to check it out. Now, they use an Indian woman because it's what people have been taught to expect when it comes to tech support, Indian, and then woman because it's harder to say no to a woman than it is to a man. The real attackers utilize those biases to get people to comply with things that they should not. So we do that, but then we turn it on them and tell them, hey, this bias was successful for us, so you need to maybe train, like you said, do some diversity training, do some bias training, because these things can help you be more secure. So although we do use them,
that's interesting.
We do try to make sure that we don't just, flat out use them and then say, haha, no way to fix it, kind of thing.
Yeah. So here's an interesting hypothesis. I'm going to imagine that in some cases, at least, the clients that you're trying to kind of, hack may be fairly homogeneous companies themselves. And I wonder if what you just described could not be used. And again, this is more relevant to what I do than to what you do, but could it be used to encourage companies to hire more diverse teams?
Well, it's really interesting that you bring that up because based on our statistics, women are more successful in phishing calls. And by successful, they get more compromises than their male counterparts, regardless of the gender they're calling.
Interesting.
So maybe that's the case. It seems anecdotally maybe more like it is a comfort level with women, regardless of gender, rather than a hiring on the client side. But I don't have enough statistics to back that up. But we do see across the board, regardless of the gender you're calling, women are more successful at compromising the target.
Yeah. Actually, that makes sense. I want to tell you about another fun study that I read about recently that shocked a lot of people. It had been known for some time that if you take two identical resumes and you put a male name on one and a female name on the other one, that recruiting managers will tend to favor the male names. What people had not realized until recently, and there's similar kinds of biases where, both gender and perceived ethnicity can be considered almost like a tax. But apparently women are just as guilty of that as men. So women tend to defer to male leaders more than female leaders. They tend to create a sense of greater value around those, and they tend to rate resumes higher, which I found a little bit surprising until you think about it and you think, well, again, if we go back to what these biases represent, they are a manifestation of what we have learned. And let's face it, when we look on TV, when we go to the movies, when we read books, if the media is dominated by images of women in certain roles who are trustworthy and men in certain different roles that are less trustworthy, then of course that kind of learning is going to be true whether you as the audience member are male or female. So I guess what you're saying, Kat, makes perfect sense, that there would not be a big gender difference in terms of the recipient, but that there would be a big gender difference in terms of the perpetrator, as it were.
So bringing it back to your first point, is that an example of structural biases in impacting individual biases?
It's a bit of a fine line here. This is not an exact categorization, but I think of procedural biases. So, for example, if you allow a subjective decision by a human being to influence the process of reviewing your resumes, then you're influencing. That's what I mean by procedural bias. So in that particular case, you have an individual bias that is allowed, or you allow that individual bias to influence the process, in this case of reviewing resumes. So I would describe it as a procedural bias, but as you pointed out, it's effectively piggybacking on an individual bias that already exists. You're just allowing that to take place. So one way that you could counter that is you could say, you know what, we're going to do blind resume reviews, or we're going to, come up with some other way. We're going to do video interviews instead of doing resumes, or there's a million other ways that people go about, or you call that out and you make people aware of the fact that, hey, you're probably biased about gender. So be doubly careful when you're looking at women's resumes that you don't discount them just because of the gender.
Yeah, I guess my question was more about and I think this is a structural bias, but the structural bias of the media, you're saying, influences the individual people's perception of women.
Absolutely. Okay. You're spot on. Exactly. That's an example of a structural bias where it's not any one person. I mean, ultimately it could boil down to Harry Weinstein, right? It's the sort of very unfortunate biases that have pervaded, in this case, media and entertainment. But of course, the same is true in finance and in technology, and virtually every field that you look at. There are very glaring examples of structural biases of that type.
Interesting.
So, in Kat's previous comment about women always being more successful, there was one time with one client that proved to not be true. We worked for a manufacturing company, and the only time women were more successful was when they played an HR role as opposed to IT. If a woman tried to play an IT role, she generally was shut down very fast. And that literally was a large company full of, mid 40 to mid 50-year-old men. And any woman in the company was a secretary or an assistant, and that's it. It just didn't fit to have them call as tech support.
Chris, this makes me think of an interesting comment here. You asked me earlier on about the ability to kind of learn about some of these biases. I almost feel like the work that you're doing could be a fascinating way of spotting existing biases that people don't normally think about. And, because I think about how people tend to notice in the world of diversity and inclusion training and things of that sort, people tend to base their opinion on, we know, like we do these studies that show that that women's resumes are not valued as much. But in a way, what you're doing is you're doing almost like the implicit. I don't know if you heard about the implicit association test that Harvard University has, but rather than asking you specifically how do you feel about people of color versus white people, what they do is they show you a bunch of pictures of faces of either people of color or white people, and then they ask you to associate them with words. And then you spot biases in kind of an implicit way. And in a way where you're describing some of the things that you do and some of the phenomena that you observe are very clear potential indicators of latent biases that we may not be aware are even there. Like, the one that you described seems kind of obvious. Like, we're used to thinking of IT guys, right? I mean, it's the IT guy. Typically, you don't get a lot of women in IT. You get some, but certainly not as many. Whereas in HR, you tend to see a lot of women. And there may be some less obvious situations where your work may be able to highlight, just by showing when people let their guard down and allow themselves to be manipulated, that may be an indicator of other kinds of biases that may be a little bit more unusual or less likely that somebody studying diversity and inclusion would think about that. So just something to think about. There could be some interesting crossovers here.
So we may end up working together on some future research and biases, what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting because we've never really gathered the data for that purpose. But now in discussing it, it does seem like we have done it, but maybe not for research purposes, but for analyzing our clients and saying, hey, here's what will work and here's what wouldn't work based on what we've noticed in our work.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's also sometimes a little sad to see how predictable we can be and how that predictableness can affect people's careers and lives. Maybe a little disconcerting. I mean, we've tried to work really hard in our company to make sure that success is based on accomplishment and nothing else, not your lifestyle, your gender, your color, shouldn't matter, but how good you are at the job. That's not always an easy thing to do or manage, and I can't imagine trying to do it with a company that has thousands or tens of thousands of employees as opposed to just a company with 11.
I agree. And you actually hit on a very interesting point about, there's the term meritocracy. And meritocracy, it's a very slippery idea. The idea that people advance based on their skills and their capabilities and their success is a very slippery slope because of a couple of reasons. One of them is that you require some sort of a measurement that ideally should be objective. In other words, you should be able to put two people on a scale and say this person is better than that person. But in real life, that can't really be done. And the only way that you do it is that you make some arbitrary decisions about what you think makes a person better than another person. And that's a perfect place for biases to creep in. And the moment that you take a meritocracy and you taint it with anything that is not 100% objective, you have opportunities for great abuse. And unfortunately, I happen to believe that a lot of what has been passed as meritocracy in not just in corporate America, but I think in our society in general, has unfortunately been in some cases inadvertently, and in some cases I actually think quite purposefully with the intent of creating advantage for certain people. It's a very scary thought. I mean, it's almost like a different level of SC, because now you're talking about, how can I use my, the regulations and the rules at the societal level to effectively drive shifts that are going to be favoring particular classes of people. So interesting problems.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. From a scientific point, it's fascinating to always talk about, even when it's negative. I always find it interesting to look at it, and also sad that we can't come up with a great solution that the three of us can implement and it will just work, across the globe. Maybe your training that you've been working on will help at least make some effective change in some companies that can then spread, which kind of leads me to that question. This has been a fascinating discussion. Our group, the people that listen to this podcast, will definitely be interested in this topic because it's right up our alley of trying to understand how humans think and make decisions. So if people wanted to find out more about you or your research, where can they go to find out more?
I would say probably the best place to start is I have two websites. The main one is aleria.tech. So it's aleria.tech. And that's the software company that I described. And then my academic website is at QSDI, as in Quantitative Studies of Diversity and Inclusion.org. And then from there, especially from the commercial website, you can also find links to my Forbes blog. I write on Forbes regularly about diversity and inclusion. Also, the company, we have a newsletter. We have a Medium channel called Aleria. We also have a Twitter and Facebook presence with the same name. So pretty easy to find. But I would say Aleria is kind of a good first place to start.
Excellent. That really, really is awesome. And, one of the things that we do every month, we have people who love to read, that not only listen to podcasts, but they either read books or do audiobooks. A lot of people have long commutes back and forth to work. And it doesn't have to be on this topic, but if it is, that's fine. Do you have a book that you could recommend that you think people would enjoy reading?
I have three very specific ideas. If you are interested in understanding the impact of specifically of diversity and inclusion and gender inequality in the workplace, there is a short and just absolutely extremely well-written book by Ruchika, and that's spelled Ruchika, and the last name is Tulshyan. And the name of the book is The Diversity Advantage, Fixing Gender Inequality in the Workplace. I found it to have one of the best summaries of the kinds of biases that exist, and also very, very practical examples of things that can really help companies to improve that way. And completely opposite end of the spectrum, there is a novel that I read shortly after it came out that got a lot of coverage, was very successful. And it's a novel called The Hate You Give, and that's spelled with just the letter U, by Angie Thomas. And it's actually meant to be kind of as a young adult novel, but I found it absolutely fascinating because it gives an inside view of a teenager who experiences some of the kinds of things that we hear about in terms of police brutality, Black Lives Matter. And I found that the way that it was written was just so compelling. It made me, as a person, I'm just your average kind of white guy. So it really opened my eyes through what I thought was an absolutely gripping novel full of twists and turns and adventure, but it also gave me insights into things that I never really understood. And then there was one third one that came to mind just because of what we were talking about a few moments ago that I highly, highly recommend when it comes to the point of structural biases and how they've impacted the way the society has made decisions. And that's a book, it's actually now more than 10 years old, but I think it's a fantastic book called When Affirmative Action Was White. And the author of that is Ira Katznelson, Katznelson. And that one really goes into some of the history from Civil War, civil rights, and how people actually manipulated large chunks of the population to achieve certain political goals. And it gives a really unique perspective as to how certain racist notions really were born not out of racist thoughts, but out of political thoughts. And I highly recommend that to anybody that wants to understand a bit of this kind of social engineering at the societal level, especially if you're interested in some of these issues of race and culture here in the United States.
Yeah, I can see that. I wrote them all down, and we'll add these to the show notes. This is fascinating. Great recommendations. Appreciate you having more than one, too.
Oh, my pleasure. I do read a lot. I love reading, and there's a ton of great books, but these three, I think, give you a good broad spectrum and a variety of different angles as well.
Oh, excellent. I really can't thank you enough. This was a fascinating topic, and even if though slightly disturbing, still something that we really enjoy to analyze and talk about. So thank you for coming on the show.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. It's been really a pleasure being on the show, and thank you, Kat. And it's been great talking to everybody. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'd be more than happy. I'm an intellectual junkie. I love to solve difficult problems, and will gladly talk to anyone.
Uh-oh, you may have opened the floodgates with that offer.
And
All right.
Paolo, do you have a Twitter? I'm sorry if I missed that.
Yes, actually, probably the best one again is our company Twitter, and it's actually Aleria PBC. So it's ALERIA PBC, as in Public Benefit Corporation. That's our official legal name, is Aleria PBC.
Wait, so are you a B Corp?
No, the Public Benefit Corporation is actually a recognized legal entity by the state of Delaware, whereas the B Corp is a certification that you can get separately. Subtle differences. We're still for profit, But it means that in addition to worrying about our shareholders, we also have to worry about a public benefit statement that we have that has to do with increasing diversity and inclusion.
That is cool.
But anyway, so Aleria PBC with those 3 letters at the end actually is Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We use the same handle for all 3.
And is that it's spelled again? A-L?
So it's ALERIAPBC.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paolo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Man, another truly fascinating podcast. And now he's got my brain spinning with research ideas.
Right? He's so interesting. And I'm like, there are so many opportunities that we haven't delved into yet.
Yeah, I know. Oh, I love it and hate it.
I know.
I promised my wife and myself I would not come up with any more ideas for at least another 6 months. And now I have some. Maybe I could not tell her.
Except that this is public and you have an open relationship
it on the recorded
wife. Yeah.
What is wrong with me? Why do I have no brain? I'm actually a smart person, but I'm not.
It's just so interesting. There are so many interesting things in the world, and Paolo tied a bunch of threads together, and now I want to know more. And there are statistically valid ways in which we could conduct this, which is very entertaining.
Yeah, I know. And being able to actually explain a little bit about why certain things that we do work would be really fascinating.
It would, yeah. And again, that I think there's an element to this whole conversation that is also, if the SE game changed because clients or others or groups of people were becoming more diverse, that would be awesome. But it would be really interesting to track that and compare that and be able to speak knowledgeably over, this is why this strategy works in this environment and not in another.
Yeah, that's would be maybe an interesting way to help train on, I don't want to say individual because it may not be so individual, but as a company, I'm thinking like, classifying a company as an individual, like personalizing research for a company. Like I'm thinking about that one manufacturing company that we worked with. That would have been a great piece of training to say, that women always work when they call about XYZ, and then to help them with some diversity training to understand that they need to question it and not just assume it's true because a woman's on the phone saying she's from HR.
Yeah. And I think it's also, I'm not sure if I'm going to articulate this as well as I want, but when you speak about social engineering to anyone not in the industry, I feel like it's a very quick jump to, well, that sounds like sales. And so in some ways, yes, but I think it's really fascinating how being a social engineer really does rely on that social component of the title as well as the systems and the engineering side. And yes, some of the strategies are used in sales, but the strategies could be used elsewhere too to really convey and elevate some thought processes, I think, which is a fascinating concept.
Okay, well, we can talk about this for hours more, but I'm sure people are saying, hey, come on now.
Stop being nerds.
Stop being nerds for a second and tell us the important stuff, like how to contact you, because we don't know.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you want to ping Kat and talk about, biases, or if you want to be biased against Kat, you can do it on Twitter.
Thanks, boss.
No problem.
Maybe let's avoid the. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
All right.
If you want to talk to my least favorite employee on Twitter, you can do so at Kat Murdoch with a 0.
Yes.
At Twitter.
You can.
And I'll let you guess where the 0 is.
It's a mystery.
It's a mystery 0. You're never going to get tweeted again. No one's going to figure it out.
I have more faith than our listeners and people in general.
Oh, I do too. I meant yes. Here we are live again.
Cool.
If you want to yell at me for being a jerk, you can do that at Human Hacker. But if you want to hear all the cool stuff we're doing, you can do it at the corporate, which is SOC Engineer Inc. Our website's www.social-engineer.org and social-engineer.com. This is the July podcast, so if you're coming out to DEF CON, that's next month. We'll see you there live. See ya. Staring through the embers on the 1st of November, and remember you were born at
chosen